Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz, and we have a great guest today to talk about Rose Wilder Lane, one of the three theories of libertarianism. He is a history professor with books on the rise and fall of mutual aid, Rose Wilder Lane, and the New Deal's protracted war on the Bill of Rights. He is also a co-editor of the new book, Rose Lane Says, which he's here to talk to us about today. Professor David Beito, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to this.
Right off the bat, who was Rose Wilder Lane?
Well, Rose Wilder Lane was a daughter of Laura Ingalls Wilder, so her mother's much better known than she was. Her mother wrote the Little House on the Prairie books, but Rose Wilder Lane played a key role in those books as well as editor, and some people said she, was one of the writers. So they very much formed a partnership. And so Lane was born, I think, 1888 in South Dakota, I believe, but family moved around a lot. She became a working journalist and was very successful as a journalist, and then started to be kind of a ghostwriter and a writer. And she wrote a lot of biographies. She wrote a biography of Charlie Chaplin. She wrote a biography of Herbert Hoover. I'm trying to think of some of the others, but she was sort of a well-known journalist. She had dallied with communism for a time. She knew people like John Reed, and she was sort of caught up in the enthusiasm, but rapidly turned against it, especially when she visited the Soviet Union in the 1920s and saw that it just was destroying the country, and encountered some farmers who basically made this argument, Russia is too big. It's one big head, and it can't control what we're doing here, and, leave us alone, basically. So she was very much into the idea of kind of self-government, but she basically became a libertarian, and that's kind of an understatement, because there's an argument to be made that it was Rose Wilder Lane who first came up with using the term libertarian to describe what we think today of libertarians: free market, limited government, that kind of thing. All right, so she was a kind of a well-known journalist, a well-known novelist. Wrote a couple books about the frontier, growing up on the frontier. And then she wrote a thing called Credo, and then I'm trying to think of the other book that she wrote in the 30s. But she wrote a couple books where she just sort of gave her sort of her defense of libertarianism, I guess you could say, her criticisms of the New Deal. Then she had someone who worked for her, a black woman, and Lane saw the black woman was reading a paper called the Pittsburgh Courier, which just so happened to be the leading African-American newspaper in the United States. It had something like 200,000 subscribers. So it was widely read throughout the country. It was distributed, by a lot of ways, including Pullman porters would travel throughout the country, and they would bring copies to other people. So it was a well-known paper, and she wrote a fan letter because she liked what she read in the paper. There were a lot of things to like about it. For example, it had a very cosmopolitan staff of op-ed writers. It had a Japanese American, for example, that some people still might be old enough to remember, named as Hayakawa. I forgot his last name, Sessio, I think. There's an actor with the same name. But anyway, he was a very well-known linguist, and ended up as a U.S. Senator, Republican U.S. Senator in the 1980s. They had someone from India. They had another white person. And so they had, so she was enthused, and the editor, or whoever the person she wrote to, wrote her back. His name was Joel Rogers, by the way. He wrote her back and said, "Would you like to write for us?" And she said, "Sure." And so she joined this staple of op-ed writers, and she wrote a weekly column from, I think it was September 1942 to August, I believe, 45. So she wrote it for, quite a few columns. There are over 100 of them. Some of them are not very legible. Some of them, kind of repetitive. So we picked, I think it was 84 of the columns and reprinted them in the book. And so what's interesting about these columns, first of all, nobody knew about, well, that's unfair, but they've been shunted aside. There's a biography of Lane, for example, that told me about these. It's, she wrote for this kind of obscure black paper. It wasn't obscure, it was the leading black paper. And nothing's really been written about it. So I was able to get copies of the columns from a number of sources, including the fact that many of them are online. There are copies of many of them in the the hard copies, not of the column itself, but of the print copy or whatever you want to call it that was turned into the column. And so we were able to reconstruct all of these and put them in a book. Now, what's interesting about these is, first of all, she wrote a book in 1943 called Discovery of Freedom, which is her best known book for libertarians, where she lays out her agenda, which is basically sort of had this theory that we all have an equal energy, right, in some sense. And that's it's very much an attack. It's very much a defense of individual rights, in which she sees as various forms of collectivism, which she groups under a category of kind of paganism in a way. All right. So it's got history. It's got a lot of interesting things, like she's a big fan of Islam in a lot of ways, which would make her out of place with a lot of modern conservatives, because she points out Islam believed in private property and that kind of thing. So it's a very interesting book. But she wrote this, and in her lifetime, it maybe had 2,000 people read it. A typical issue of the Courier would go to 200,000. So she was exposed to a much larger audience in the Courier. Now, what did she write? She doesn't trim her sails. She doesn't try to shunt aside her libertarianism. She defends laissez-faire, which she calls laissez-faire. She says, we can have a laissez-faire world. It's possible. She's writing this in 1943, for God's sake. She's a low point for liberty. She's saying we can have a laissez-faire world, right? People at a time, people like Hayek and so forth, they don't want to use that word, like that terminology anymore. It's not practical, whatever. So she's pushing a hardline libertarian position, but she recognizes she has an audience who are not familiar with that, who have different concerns. And so she links it to African-American ideas and African-American experience. She immerses herself in the African-American experience. She reads people like Du Bois and reads her fellow columnists and tries to engage in productive discussion with them, praises them, criticizes them gently, and tries to kind of stir things up in a kind of very friendly way with people. And she gives examples of entrepreneurship, how America is a land where, somebody can become a millionaire if they have the right idea. And she uses the example of Henry Ford. But then she pairs that example with Richard Vann, who was the orphan who founded the Pittsburgh Courier. So she does this rags to riches story using a black example, a white example. She is defending a lot of the things. If you've read Discovery of Freedom, I don't know if you have, this is kind of preparatory to it and combined with it. A lot of the ideas that are in there show up in her book. She is really radical in her criticisms of oppression of African Americans, lynching. She, for example, she has a lot in there, about that, and, the outrage of lynching, and makes it personal. Says, I never knew about this stuff was happening. Why haven't I heard about this? All this stuff going on. She compares slavery to living in a concentration camp. Right? She says they're like concentration camps, which is a view that historians many years later, there was a historian named, I forget his name now, but he made that argument, right? Well, she's making that argument earlier, but she's not a downer. What's interesting about her is she said, look, here are people that lived under these oppressive conditions, and look at all the progress she made. Like someone like Robert Higgs, for example. And earlier, Frederick Douglass, they said, look at all the accomplishments he made. People tended to dismiss them, but all the banks that were set up, all the businesses, all the economic progress, the land purchased and so forth that occurs in the decades right after slavery tend to be discounted, but really amazing accomplishments. And she said, she quotes Du Bois and said, it's really amazing that they've done this. How could they have done this and all the obstacles they faced? But they did it anyway. We have a lot to learn from this. She quotes Du Bois because Du Bois has this, basically this novel where he talks about this guy says, well, what do you have? And, I said, I don't have anything. I don't have a dime. All I've got is, he says something like, all I've got is freedom, just freedom. And she goes through this long thing. They came out of slavery in rags. They had no money. All they had was just freedom, right? I don't know if she said just freedom, but it was something like that. And then she goes on to say, look at all the things they accomplished. So she leads like with this, oh man, they're poor. Everything's horrible. All they've got is freedom. And look what they were able to do with that. Really quite interesting. So I was stunned by these. And you got to remember the time they were written as well. And this needs to be, publicized, especially because the libertarians are kind of given a bad name. Oh, you don't care about, poor people or African American. Here's a woman that immersed herself at a time when conventional liberals were really not going along with FDR went along with these really horrible racist politicians. Didn't do anything really about lynching and voting rights. Terrible civil rights record. Well, she's pushing back against that.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the discovery of freedom, and that was actually, well, my introduction to Rose Wilder Lane came from a book called The Triumph of Liberty by Jim Powell, and it had, I think, 64 mini biographies of figures throughout history that impacted liberty, had a positive impact on human liberty. But I did read Discovery of Freedom, I think 22 or 23 years ago. And she breaks down, she says there's been 3 attempts in human history at trying to establish a free society. The first one, I think, was either ancient Greece or the Republic of Rome. I'm not entirely sure. But the second one, the third one is the United States. But the second one, and this is what I want to ask you about, is she talks about the Saracens. The Saracens are essentially, from what I could gather, were the Moors that invaded Spain. And she does talk about, like you said, the property rights. But I've never come across anything else that intimated that the Muslims tried to establish a free society. And I've actually read critiques of her that said she got that wrong. What is your take on that?
I think there's an element of truth there. I think it's oversimplistic. Of course, the Saracens, you're talking also about, during the Crusades. Saladin was, associated with the Saracens, fighting the Crusaders. I think I think certainly Islam looks pretty good compared to what's going on in much of Europe at the time. You have toleration of Christians and Jews, albeit, they are in a kind of second-class status. They have to pay a special tax, which, by the way, was abolished in the 19th century. A lot of people think that that's still going on. I mean, maybe some, ISIS tried to do it and a few other people, but, but they were second-class citizens, but they were tolerated. There were hundreds of thousands of Christians, many Jews in the Middle East. They often served roles as advisors and, lived in peace to a great extent. Now, I'm saying that in comparison to what was happening in Christian Europe, where the Jews were, were confined to ghettos. In many cases, were expelled completely. There were all sorts of pogroms against them. So I think she does exaggerate. I think there's an element of truth there, that there's some appreciation for trade. That's what Muhammad was. He was a merchant, right? So there was something to that. I think there were real problems with the whole property rights system in a lot of the Islamic countries. It was kind of a chaotic system, didn't necessarily produce a lot of stability. But I think there's an element of truth there, and I think that there's a lot of learning going on in the Islamic world, and it kind of takes a departure, I think, in a certain sense, when you get certain elements of Islam, which basically are more reactionary elements. There is a period where you've got these very interesting openings for more liberal elements, and that is kind of quashed at a certain point. So I think you want to view this in comparative terms. So I think there's some truth in it. She points out that there were these extended trade networks going on, that were really quite impressive, spanning, all of North Africa and Asia, and that the Muslims took part in that. But I think she overdoes it. Yeah. She overdoes a lot of things in some sense, but there's still a lot there that's definitely, that's on point, right?
Sure. And she was an avid defender of human freedom, of individualism, and of individual rights. What was unique about her view of individual rights?
Well, it's very cosmopolitan, right? And we need a little bit more cosmopolitans today, I think. We had a president, wants to take over the Panama Canal in Greenland or whatever. I mean, I don't know. We need a little bit more of that version of individual rights, and she's very much into it. So she'll go anywhere, and she basically makes the argument that people are if you give them the right incentives, they're going to take advantage of the incentives the right way. She is often criticized on the left for her criticism for her views on Native Americans. But basically her argument was, and it was wrong in a way and right in a way, she said, well, a lot of the Indian tribes have kind of a primitive communism in a way, and this undermines the incentive for them to work and earn a living and be free. And that's good that was gotten rid of, and they do now have incentives to buy property and go into business and be individuals. Now the problem with that theory is I think she, maybe a lot of historians at the time were wrong about this too. But if you look at the history of American Indian societies, you find wide variety. A lot of them did have private property, for example. They had a wide variety of political systems, and she might have found inspiration in some of those. But she was coming at it from this angle. She wasn't saying that they were inferior or something like that. She was saying everybody is the same as individuals if you give them an incentive. And she's always trying to look for examples, even though she's very much pro-America, pro-American founding. She sees the U.S. as kind of an inspiration, but she's always looking for other examples outside of the U.S. context to highlight. And she's got some interesting spins that a lot of libertarians, including myself, might have problems with. For example, she has this critique of the UN, which a lot of us would agree with. She said, oh, they're talking about creating a UN. I'd rather have strychnine. No, that sounds horrible. Well, then she has her own solution. And what her solution is interesting. Why not admit all these foreign countries as American states and put them on an equal plane with other states. We already have a world government. It's called the American Constitution. Let them join, and it's sort of I never thought of that, but maybe there's some problems with that. But that was her solution. So she's sort of an internationalist in that way, but was very anti-war when it came to World War II. She supported the movement to stay out of the war, but in some ways she's a hyper internationalist in her views. Very pro free trade. I don't know if this is entirely unique, but defender of the Second Amendment, which is a great thing about the Second Amendment that she wrote about, and the advantages of it. Private post office, private schools. She's making an argument to this black audience of 200,000 why the school system should be privatized and why private education is superior. So that's pretty unique in that way.
I learned from reading your book new things about her that I previously didn't know. For instance, just how religious that she was, and her view of God as sort of the source of our rights. But her religious views don't seem in line with traditional religious views. For instance, she extols selfishness as a great benefit, that we're all selfish and we should be selfish, and that's how we forge civilizations. In what ways does her religion shape her political and economic philosophies?
She's very, I guess you would say, theologically very flexible person, right? She's not a kind of rigid person. She, as I said, at one point, she even thought of converting to Islam. She didn't do it. So I would say she's a very heterodox kind of Christian. But I think certainly she would see it as rights are God-given, right? So she would have sort of that argument that in a certain sense, we all have this human energy that's unique. We control it, and that this comes from God in some sense. She, is often, writing about examples from the New Testament and the Old Testament, but in kind of an interesting spin. Like, for example, she said, you want democracy? Democracy is bad. Democracy killed Jesus, right? Which says they had a vote, right? Barabbas or Jesus, and they voted, all very democratic. Look at that. I thought that was an interesting argument, but she'll do a kind of interesting spin on it. So you're right about selfishness. That's what struck me, and I'm wondering to what extent, the influence worked with her and Rand, and they did know each other. Because she has this very interesting argument about, defending selfishness, where she said, look at women. Women are the primary victims of this theory of selflessness. You ever heard the expression? She doesn't even have a soul to call her own, right? She's just so giving. She does, and she said that's bad. Now, a lot of people would conclude from that, like people conclude from when they read about Ayn Rand, oh, she must have been this terrible person, right? Nobody liked her, and she was just out for herself. Not at all. She was one of the more, I guess you'd say, giving people out there. She adopted several people, several children. She supported them. And, some of these, people that she kind of adopted had really rocky lives and had rough times, and she stuck by them. So she was a very, if we met her, you would, she'd do anything for you. She's very helpful and very pleasant to be around, right? That's my impression of her, that she was strongly opinionated. At one point she said she criticized Ludwig von Mises for not being libertarian enough, right? And I was like, he was sort of like, who is this person, doing this? But she was a very pleasant person to be around and would try to connect with people. And I would see that in these articles. She said, well, my friend, what's his name, wrote an article for the Courier last week and says this, and that's really true. That's really a good point. However, what about this? She would do that kind of thing. Yeah.
It makes sense what I'm about to say about her, given the audience and given the paper she's writing for. But I never knew the extent of her views on race, on racism, on I guess I don't know if the term was even around yet, but civil rights. And she's got some interesting takes on it. Can you tell us about her views on race, on racism, on what she thought about how the law should affect different people of different races?
She had utter contempt for racism, but also she didn't buy into the kind of theory of sort of race, positive race pride and that kind of thing. Well, it's complicated. Here's what she said, I think these are totally arbitrary terms. We're all individuals. This is meaningless. This is ridiculous, right? The ridiculous fallacy of race. And then she would say, I think this, however, I know that there are African Americans who have lived experiences different than mine, who have lives I can't really appreciate, who have experiences that are different and want to take pride in others, African Americans, and their achievements. And who am I to question that? I'm an outsider. And so she sort of have that view of people that go out there and brag about, this is the first Black person to do that, and this is the first Black person to do this. And she sort of said, well, that's great, right? I'm with you on that, because I can't really dispute that, because I haven't lived what you've lived. And she writes this thing about novels, about art, and she says, she praises, she basically makes the argument that art is kind of timeless. So somebody who is could write about slavery, who is I'm trying to think. Basically, she's making the argument that you can write about things that you haven't experienced, but that your sensitivities are going to be different, right? I'm not really stating it, but it's a very interesting argument that she makes, where she says, I could write about, I could write about the things Tolstoy writes about, but I wouldn't really be familiar with a lot of the things he's familiar with, Russian life and so forth. But he's writing about things that apply to everybody. That's sort of her argument. Romance and perseverance and disappointment. He's writing about things that everybody can understand. So she sort of made that kind of argument. I'm not stating it very well. She would state it better by herself, but she engages in a debate with somebody who sort of criticizes, because at one point she praises Gone with the Wind. And this person says, how could she praise that book? And it goes back and forth, where they have this very interesting discussion. Very thoughtful discussion on Lane's part, I think, especially.
Yeah, first of all, she points out that why focus on skin hue? Why not focus on hair color or eye color? Because she says these are all just as arbitrary. Like, why not talk about the blue-eyed person's experience or the redhead's experience? And I think that she makes some good points, and I think there's also, and I think she recognizes it, that yes, these are arbitrary constructions. I don't disagree with that. And she says that writing fiction and writing is ultimately about writing about people in the human
Yeah,
experience.
you're stating it much better than I did.
Right. So
exactly.
you have
Yeah.
Tolstoy writes War and Peace. This is ultimately about human beings, human relationships, and that's stuff that we can all relate to. It doesn't matter that the fact that it takes place in Russia during the Napoleonic Wars is almost an accident or a secondary feature, that it's
Yes,
really about
exactly.
humans. And so she says, there's no reason that I can't write about African Americans or anybody else. And there's some truth to that, but there's also the truth that whether these are arbitrary constructs or not, people have different experiences because of things like their sex or their race, because human beings get treated differently because of that, especially then. And I think she does recognize it, so I don't want to act like she's oblivious to it. So, but I do think that she has a good point. I just think it can, like you said earlier, with much of what she says, it can be taken too far.
Well, there's a parallel. Zora Neale Hurston, who is not often linked with the theories of libertarianism, although I've made an argument that she kind of should be. The Hurston had a lot in common with the other theories, right? And was basically a libertarian, I would say. But Hurston is a very much critic of racism, like Lane, but like Lane in a way, well, even more so. Hurston is got the creds, right? She writes about the Black experience. She's an anthropologist. She appreciates it, but she also attacks what she sees as the ridiculousness of race. And Hurston often was said, look, I want to write about white people. And her best known, whether she succeeded or not is a good point. Her best known novel is Their Eyes Are Watching God, which is about Black people, about a Black community in Florida where she grew up, kind of. But she also wrote a book about white, which I haven't read, I have to confess, I need to, but sort of about white poor people, called Seraph the Swanee. And nobody reads it. And apparently it's quite good. And it's got all white characters. Her last book was about Herod, King Herod, right? She wants to, even though she's got these incredible creds, she believes a Black person can write about white people, and I would presume she would believe the same. So her views are remarkably close to Lane. If you were to take some of Hurston's writings on race, pair it with Lane's, you couldn't tell the difference. Their arguments are really quite similar. And so I think that's an interesting debate that you see, but she has somebody on her side. I don't know if those two women knew each other. They should have known each other. I mean, Hurston did know Patterson. I don't know how well, but I don't know if she knew Lane. Although they had a lot of interesting connections, like Hurston ended up writing for the Pittsburgh Courier in the 1950s, for example. So they probably did know of each other, but their views are just so close. It's really, I would just wish these women would get in a room together and we could hear them talk.
It's interesting. The title of this episode is actually Libertarian Fury, discussing Rose Wilder Lane with David Beito. And the three theories of libertarianism, of course, are Rose Wilder Lane, Isabel Patterson, and Ayn Rand. So my last question for you is, how are the three theories similar to one another? How were they different? And what was their mutual influence on one another?
Okay, a lot of similarities in relationships with men. All right. If you look at Lane and Patterson, I think it was basically the same thing. They were briefly married. They used their married name, but the marriages didn't last because they both chose kind of husbands who were not their equal in any sense, kind of unambitious people, right? Who they just did not choose well. Now you can decide for yourself whether Rand chose well. In a sense, I guess she did, although she had some problems with that marriage as well. But she was married to a man who was a very mild-mannered character. They were married for many years, but he was not really her intellectual equal. And there were some problems in that marriage, but it did last a long time. So there's some similarity to there, I think, between them. as far as their personal relationships. If you looked at Lane and Patterson, they both come out of frontier experiences. In the case of Patterson, it's Canadian context. And if you look at the case of Lane, it's, the American frontier. So they're both into that. Rand really doesn't come out of that kind of background. Rand is a good deal younger than Lane and Patterson. That's why I like putting Patterson in there, or Hurston in there, because she does come out of a kind of frontier experience, and she's about the same age. So that's a difference. They are both not college educated. All three of them are not college educated. They're largely self-educated people. That's a similarity. And of course, they have some views that are very similar, but some interesting differences. I mean, both Patterson and Lane are religious, although I would call their religion, their Christianity, kind of a very loose and flexible version of Christianity. Rand, of course, is an atheist. They move in similar circles, I guess you could say. Political circles. They know some of the same people during the time. They know each other. I get the impression that Rand and Patterson, especially, well, I know they knew each other quite well. In fact, here's an opportunity for someone. Maybe I'll do it if I ever get the money or whatever. Publish a book of the Rand-Patterson letters, which are absolutely fun and fascinating. Have you read them at all?
No, I didn't even know they existed. I mean,
Oh yeah, they had a
I know they
long
corresponded.
correspondence going on from the 30s on. And it was sort of interesting because originally Patterson is the mentor and Rand is the mentee. And then gradually, Rand is getting more important. Now, what's interesting is Patterson just loves Rand. And she says, "You're our superstar. You're great." She's like building her up constantly. But Patterson is very gossipy, and it's fun kind of gossipy. You think of Camille Paglia, right? Maybe that would be a good example. Camille Paglia, I can imagine her be kind of a gossip, right? It's sort of like, and she says stuff in there. Says, "Well, I saw Herbert Hoover the other day." This is Patterson, and he's looking a little fat there. And he must know it because he was eating grapefruit. She'll throw, and Rand does not do that. Rand doesn't get into this personal stuff, but they're fun to see Patterson do that. And then Rand's always trying to bring it back to ideas and stuff. And they have long discussions about religion and politics. Patterson at one point, no, I think Rand, she makes fun of Rand, but she also makes fun of Lane because in 1940, Patterson had supported, or Rand had supported Wendell Willkie, the Republican candidate. And Wendell Willkie, after the election, becomes really kind of friendly to, I guess you'd say, progressive Republicanism. He kind of moves left. And then he dies. He's sort of an alcoholic. He was an alcoholic, and he died in 1944. And so Patterson's writing to Rand, "I just saw that your boyfriend died." Just trying to make fun of her for having made this big mistake that Rand would admit probably was a mistake at the time of backing Willkie. They're fun. There's humor in them. There's gossip. And there's discussion of ideas on a lot, intellectual plane. I don't know why they haven't been published, but maybe we need to get together and do that.
That sounds great.
I'd be for it.
I knew they were friends for a long time, and I knew they had correspondence. I didn't know the letters existed.
It's enough for a book. Yeah.
That sounds fantastic. The similarities to me, I mean, if you were just to take their bare bones economic political positions, they'd probably be very, very similar. But Lane and Patterson both talk a lot about energy in kind of an esoteric way, right? This energy that's flowing and it's creating. They also both believe in God, although Patterson, I believe, was a deist or more deistic in her thinking.
I think she converted to might have been is Episcopalianism or something like it,
Oh,
almost
okay.
on her deathbed, which is
But
pretty close to deism in
yeah,
some ways.
but
Yeah.
they're very those two are very similar in their religious views and sort of the way they present individual rights. Whereas Rand is an atheist and she's very matter of factly, but whereas Patterson seems like a very nice person, easy to get along with. Patterson and Rand are very acerbic in the way that they write, in the way that they speak, and ultimately, of course, they had the big falling out with one another. So there's just there's interesting to me the similarities and differences. How would you weight their respective influences?
I think Patterson's book, God of the Machine, which has a very sort of different view of this energy idea. Um, Very much she's into designing and as the structure, and she very much sees the Constitution as kind of an engineering. She uses almost the model of engineering to describe it in a way. Patterson does. Um, I I think that book was very, a lot of people read it, a lot of people cited it. I think you could certainly see parallels with Rand. I mean, much of it where she talks about the humanitarian and the guillotine. That's just stuff out of Rand. It seems like, right? Now, who came first and so forth. I think that they both influenced each other. So I think that it was influential in that sense. I think Lane was much more influential in the libertarian movement. Patterson was not a movement person. I don't think really Rand was either, but Lane was. And she would do a lot of conferences and things, give speeches, build networks, kind of encourage people. She was associated with Robert Lefebvre, and he had something called the Freedom School. And they would have her. He was trying to build a college. Lefebvre was a real character, by the way, kind of a flim-flam man, but interesting guy. He wrote this book that I highly recommend, where he wrote a letter to every member of Congress, and he said, I think you need to resign. And he cited Lysander Spooner, which basically he says, read this and, you need to resign. And he actually got replies from a lot of these congressmen. And some of them one of them even said, well, maybe you're right, but I can't resign. They go back. It's really fun. But he was a real character. I don't know who I'd compare him to. There are probably a lot of people like that in the libertarian movement now, kind of a seat of the pants, kind of interesting guy. But anyway, she would go and she funded his effort. She had obviously some influence on the libertarianism indirectly, because her heir, kind of adopted in a way, was Roger McBride, who was the first Libertarian Party candidate, was the producer of the Little House on the Prairie series. It was her heir. So she died before that, but obviously had some influence. There are views she had, though, that a lot of libertarians even then would have not liked. Like, she ended up in the 60s being a fan of the Vietnam War. So that's a big
Wow.
switch. And she was a correspondent, went there and wrote these stories about, the inspiring fight of the South Vietnamese, and that's domino thesis, all this stuff. So whatever, I'll forgive her for that. But she was still at the time, though, very much immersed in libertarianism. And I would suspect if you were to talk to people during the 60s, if there are many of them left who were involved in the movement, they would probably have encountered her. I don't know if Rothbard did. I suspect, I think he would have encountered her somewhere, along the line. Would he have encountered Patterson? Maybe not. She's more of a solitary figure. And Rand, again, is off doing her thing, right? She's got her own little circle around her.
Okay, so before we go, tell us, where can people find you and where can they find this book?
Well, they can just go, I'm on Facebook and I'm on Twitter, but they can just go to the University of Alabama History Department, and I got links to a lot of my work there. So if you want a lot of my articles and that kind of thing, but you can get the book. There we go. You can get the book at there we go. You get the book at at Amazon, and it's a reasonable price. $29. That's not too bad these days for books. And again, this is a collection of, we have an introduction, my colleague and I, Marcus Witcher, where we lay it out, describe it, but then we just print the op-eds. We print over 80 of them. They're fun to read. And you read them. So I thought that they're easy on the eyes. She writes plain and directly, and she tells you what she thinks, right? But she does it in her own kind of way that's connected to personal experiences. She's a woman of the world. She's not like me, a lot of people I know. She's got all sorts of interesting interests, like needlepoint. Lane was one of the leading people to write on needlepoint, but she wrote a book that I haven't seen where she connected it to libertarianism. So she does stuff like this. She wanted to avoid Social Security tax, so she canned her own food and purposely earned money that could not be taken under her income was so low for a time. And she would do stuff like that. She was self-sufficient. She was a daughter of the frontier. So she was the kind of person that if you were to get her together with people like that, I mean, they'd love her, right? Can her own food, cook anything, very resourceful.
It sounds great. All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you.
And for now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. Remember, give us your comments and your likes. They help a lot. Till next time.